Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for attending what is a very interesting, powerful, necessary event that we put together here at the Office of the Public Advocate. My name is Solomon Acevedo. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Deputy Public Advocate for Justice, Health, Equity, and Safety. And I'm very honored to be here to have a conversation that's not the conversation that's typically highlighted when we talk about gun violence. But we've chosen this day, May 31st, the end of Mental Health Awareness Month, on the cusp of the beginning of Gun Violence Awareness Month, to talk about grief and guns, to talk about the ways that our communities are impacted by gun violence, not from a perspective of what mass shootings do to our communities, although mass shootings are indeed tragic, but about neighborhoods that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence due to reasons of poverty, due to the lack of opportunities that often take place in our communities that have been highlighted in reports that our office have released over the past years. And now we're trying to figure out how we can move into a deeper conversation about healing for victims who experience gun violence and the communities that are impacted there. And that's why we have a distinguished panel today, all coming from different perspectives, all with varying levels of expertise. We have Jackie Rowe Adams, Executive Director of Harlem Mothers Save, who's here to represent those who have survived losing family, sons, and here to really speak about the ways we can bring healing to the community. We have Rebecca Fisher, Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. You can feel free to clap. She's here, of course, renowned for her advocacy around making sure that gun violence is on the forefront of our consciousness. We also have Dr. Divine Pryor from Community Capacity Development, who's here to share expertise again on the ways in which our communities can benefit from healing and from being connected to community in that special way. We have Basim Spate from CJI, who is a community researcher and the chief architect behind the paper Gotta Make It to Heaven, which highlights a study of 330 young people in Crown Heights analyzing the reasons why youth carry guns. And of course, last but not least, we have the moderator of this panel, Public Advocate of New York City, Jumaane Lee Williams. Give it up, y'all.
All right. Thank you so much. Peace and blessing, love and light to everybody. Thanks for coming out. I know we'll be on Facebook. Peace, Facebook. Oh, we got YouTube too? Oh, big time. Peace to everybody who's out here. It's as was mentioned, it's a really important discussion as we're coming up to Gun Violence Awareness Month. And we want to take time to talk about gun violence and the impact, it has on the collective mental health. I think very often there is a lot of confusion about who's committing gun violence and why we tend to think that people in acute mental health crisis are more likely to be violent, which is not true at all. They're actually more likely to be the victims of violence or crime. But we do know the impact of gun violence, generally speaking, does inflict a lot of pain physically, but also on the mental well-being of those communities that can then perpetuate additional violence that occurs. And so we just wanted to have some quick conversations of naming that and seeing how best we can address all of those issues. And so really quick, I guess I'm gonna just go down the line and give folks an opportunity just to say something about their organization and how they respond to shootings and deaths and what they do in that space. And let's start with Jackie Adams, who we worked together on the City Council Task Force to combat gun violence. I got the first seed money for what's now known as Cure Violence. So she's been doing this work for a long time, even before that. Don't always see eye to eye, but we do see eye to eye in protecting our young people. So that's what's important. You got to have everybody on here. Absolutely. That's right. Thank you so much.
I'm on?
You're on.
And hello, everybody.
Hello.
We need some energy up here in this room.
Yeah. Energy up in here.
First, let me say to the Church of Covenant, thank you for bringing us in your space with the leadership of Jamon Williams, our public advocate. But I love this church. I haven't been down in a while, but when I heard that it was going to be here, your church played one of the key parts of me being here today. I just want you to know that. I got to say that. Wonderful church, and I hope that people that's listening will come and support this church because it have been here a while. So I'm Jackie Rowe Adams. I lost 2 kids to gun violence. And as Jumani, our public advocate, said, we've been at this a long time. And let me tell you, here we go again at the table. But we've been out here a long time fighting this fight. And I was just telling one of these young people earlier, I said, who did I tell that? I said, me and Jumani was going to have some fist fights. I said, we didn't see that. I said, but at the end of the day, we came together because it was about saving lives. And that's what it's about. So my organization been in existence since 2006. After losing my 2 kids, I could either, I said I'll either choose to live or die. I chose to live. And when I found out that so many others was out there that have had a loss and didn't know where to turn, didn't know where to go, we reached out to each other. And we walked, and I have to tell you this story. We got together in 2006. What happened was a Memorial Day or Labor Day, I don't know which one it was, but in 2006, and one day in Harlem alone, it was like 6 killings. This going back. And I said, let me call some mothers, let me call elected officials. At that time, Jamani Williams wasn't thinking about it. Maybe he was thinking about it, but he wasn't in it. So we got together and called elected official. At that time, Assemblyman Keith, he was Assemblyman Keith Wright. We got 5 mothers together and said, enough is enough, who's giving our kids these guns? And that's how we got started. We went to his office crying all over the carpet. Fast forward, Keith called 100 black law enforcement. Now, some of you are young, some of you, if you can remember, of course, Jamani, no, he was young, but you remember the 100 black law enforcement. At that time, your mayor, I don't know how much time you have, but don't give us the money. But anyway, at that time, Eric Adams was the sergeant of the 100 black law enforcement. We stood on the steps of City Hall and called a question. Who's giving out kids these guns? And we found out the 2 bodegas in Harlem and a good watermelon truck selling good collard greens and good watermelon was selling guns to our kids. And that's how Harlem Mothers started. We found out that it was 2 bodegas that 100 law enforcement got shut down and the watermelon truck in Harlem. So moving forward, that's how our organization started. And you know what? It's still going on, but it did stop because we continue to fight. We started off with 5 mothers. Now we have 50 fathers and mothers, that's out there that need support. We're a support group. We deal with the bereavement counseling. We deal with the trauma. And let's talk about the mental health. So we are dealing with all of that here in 2023. It's still going on. So I just say all this to say, Harlem mothers and fathers is still out there fighting the fight. And I'm still sitting here with our public advocate, Jamani Williams, and we're doing good together. We have saved some lives together. We might not have agreed all the time, and we probably still don't agree all the time, but guess what it's about, y'all? Working as a team, working with Ms. Fisher here, working together as a team, because so many of our kids are getting killed. A lot of people don't like to hear me talk about black on black crime, but that's just what it is. and I'll say what it is, and that's what we're gonna talk about and get straight and save some lives. And of course, Ms. Fisher gonna talk about mass shootings. But that's how we got started, and that's the work I do. And we need all of y'all help. We need all of y'all help.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
I will just say, I try to talk about crime. So they have black on black, they have white on white, they have whatever it is. Just try to talk about crime altogether. Most folks commit crime in proximity to who they are. So I just want to make sure you are correct, though. We have to talk about the violence that's going on in our community. And too many of our young folks are losing their lives. And next up, we have Rebecca Fisher, New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. I just want to shout out New Yorkers Against Gun Violence as well, because when I first met them, I guess almost over a decade now, they were really focused on mass shootings. And I remember I and some others really pushed the fact that most of the people who were dying were black and brown around handgun violence and daily violence. And to their credit, they really stepped up and started pushing on those issues. So I just want to say thank you to them, and they've been a great voice in the space.
Thank you so much to the Public Advocate and also to the Church of the Covenant for hosting this discussion. I have to say also thank you to the other advocates and community leaders who are here today. It's always a privilege for me to be part of these conversations among folks who have been doing this work for so long in their own communities. So thank you for having me. I also can always count on the Public Advocate to host conversations that are going to include folks who do not necessarily all agree. And as I always say, if you're too comfortable in the room, you're not in the right room, you're not going to actually make any change. So I like to be in rooms where there's uncomfortable conversations happening. I want to be asked uncomfortable questions. I want to ask uncomfortable questions because that's how we make change. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this, very much so. So yes, I'm Rebecca Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence and New Yorkers Against Gun Violence Education Fund. And the work that we do, we really like to take what I've heard the Public Advocate say many times, a holistic, comprehensive approach to reducing gun violence in our organization. On the one hand, we do policy work. We do policy work here in the city. We do policy work at the town level, at the national level, and we do a lot of work in Albany on legislation and policy and programs. And when I talk about policy, I don't just talk about firearm regulation, although we do work on firearm regulation. We talk about policy change that includes investment in the state and city budget, in community violence intervention programs, in school prevention programs, and also in survivor services. And so that's very much key to our policy agenda and working with community-based organizations on the ground to inform what that policy agenda can be. Because again, policymakers should not be making policy, community should be making policy. Community knows what's best for them, and their voice should be heard when it comes to what our legislators and our government officials are doing. In terms of what we do on the community side, we have our signature program, which is called Reaction. It's a school violence prevention program. It also follows the credible messenger model, and we have instructors that are from all around the city, but specifically from communities that are disproportionately impacted, communities, Black and brown communities, who understand and have been impacted by them, themselves by gun violence and violence in their communities, who go into the schools at least once a week, working with young people. Not to go into the classroom to tell young people what to do, to tell young people how to feel, but to hear from young people about what they're experiencing, because we strongly believe that they are experts on their own experience. And while they might not know all the laws that are being passed and why what's happening with politics is happening, they do know that they feel powerless in their communities. They do know that they do not feel like they have the resources that they need. And they do understand, even if they don't have the words for it, that gun violence is not just a mental health problem. It's not a mental health problem, it's a public health problem. And there are a number of different factors that contribute to what make it a public health problem. And that doesn't necessarily just go to what's happening in the individual's mind. That has to do with all the different various factors that are happening in the community and the atmosphere, in our history structurally, that are impacting the way someone's mind evolves, right? And that impacts why a young person or a community member might pick up a gun. And I will finally say this before I pass the mic. We do talk a lot about mass shootings at our organization, but we have stopped talking about the mass shootings that always get those national headlines. We're talking about the mass shootings that are happening in Black and brown communities here in New York, the ones that are not called mass shootings, but have at least 4 more people who are injured or dying from gun violence. And until we start calling those incidents of violence mass shootings, then those won't get the same investment, those won't get the same kind of attention from our media. So if we're going to talk about mass shootings, we should be talking about what's happening in the day-to-day, in the community, and making sure that we're putting resources to respond and give victims and survivors what they need. Of course, I have much more to say, but I will pass the mic to my colleague here.
And thank you for that, because people don't know sometimes that there are investments and supports that come with designations of mass shootings that our communities miss out on, but they don't get the designations even though there are mass shootings. And so thank you for pointing that out. Next up, we have Dr. Divine Pryor from Community Capacity Development, who is run by my brother from another Cape Ann. So Casey's watching, make sure you get that shout out. He has his own story and personal journey, but he's doing amazing work now, keeping our community safe. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. First, let me acknowledge the angel of this house. This is an extraordinary historical institution that we sit in today, so we're just making history just by being here. Let me acknowledge all of my colleagues on the dais, and particularly the public advocate, who has been a strong voice and advocate for human rights, for human justice for years and years. And so we're honored, and thank you for extending the invitation. My name is Dr. Divine Pryor. I am the Senior Policy Advisor for Community Capacity Development, which operates locally, regionally, and nationally, specifically to uproot systemic challenges. And that encompasses a whole range of various different challenges that we face, techniques that we use, interventions that we employ in order to address on the ground those issues which we think are negatively impacting our communities. My esteemed colleague to my right said something interesting, and that is that if the conversation is comfortable, then you're in the wrong place. So I want to assure you that when you want the conversation to be uncomfortable, you invite me. And I will definitely be true to my reputation. It's a lot on the line. Let me say this, and I want to have a real conversation, and I want y'all to know this comes from the heart. This is with love. This is not in any way meant to hurt anyone or to disparage anyone. But there's some things that we need to know. Number one, violence is not a new phenomenon in America. America was built on violence. The very core, the very foundation that everything America stands for emerged out of violence. And I'm talking about violence that you don't even want to repeat because it's so traumatic to even think about. But when you look at nursery rhymes, right? Rockin' my baby on the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. And down comes, you know the rest. The baby fell out the tree. That's violent. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. He fell down and was crushed in pieces. That's violent. When we start talking about our American creeds and our principles and the Star-Spangled Banner, we're talking about bombs bursting in midair. That's violence. We don't even want to talk about the history of slavery and all its degradation and humanity. America was built on violence. So if, in fact, we want to start somewhere, we have to start from the beginning. And then that violence and the trauma that it brought has never been addressed. If I could just take a moment just to talk about the community that I'm very familiar with, the Black community, although I'm familiar with many others, can you imagine 320 years of slavery, another 100 years of Jim Crow racism, that gives us 420, and guess what? The therapy still has not come. There's been no social worker. You don't think that a people that's been under that kind of inhumanity for 400 and something years doesn't need some counseling, doesn't need some therapy, some intervention, yet none has come. We're still waiting for the social workers. And then when you start to ask, why are Black people acting a little strange? Well, I could give you a litany of reasons why, the least of which historical trauma that has not been addressed. So what we're seeing today is symptomatic of all the things that have been bubbling up, and we refuse to accept. Had we dealt with this issue 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we wouldn't still be having this conversation in 2023. But for some reason, we don't want to talk about historical racism. We don't want to talk about discrimination. We don't want to talk about mistreatment. And we want to, in fact, I've heard people even suggest, why don't you just forget about it? It happened so long ago. I've heard that. In my last 30 seconds, let me say this, because at CCD, we deal with the root causes. We're dealing with apathy and despair. When you have people who have been neglected, pushed out, shut out, locked out for centuries, made to be invisible, mistreated, discounted, disregarded, then you get what's called apathy and despair. When people don't have access to the resources that all of us need in order to live and grow and thrive, then you have a state of deprivation. You have social distress. You have people who are not living, they're surviving. When you're surviving, that means that you're making emotional decisions. You don't have the luxury to sit back and plan a year ahead, because I don't even know if I'm going to eat tomorrow or next week. Never mind next year. So what you have now are people reacting, not responding. The difference, when you react, is from the heart. You give it no thought. When you respond, it's very thoughtful. It's very intentional. There's a difference. When people are in survival mode, when people are in a state of hopelessness and despair, what do you expect other than what we see? So if in fact we're serious about addressing violence, let's stop chasing ambulances. Let's stop treating symptoms, and let's start going to the root causes and provide some real intervention. So that's just my opening remarks. We'll get into the meat of the issue at some later time. Let me turn it back over to the public advocate.
Thank you, Doc. And next we have Bassemi. Did I say that right? Basim, my bad. They mess up Jemani all the time. Basim Spate, Community Research Coordinator from CGI, with his own story, also doing amazing work. I just want to say thank you for being here and just talk about what your organization is doing with community members to help respond to the shootings.
How everybody doing? I work for CJI now, which was CCI, Center for Court Innovation. And I've been working in that organization for 2012 as a violence interrupter and an outreach worker, right? So, and then my community of Crown Heights, stopping retaliations, doing mediations. And I did that for about like 5 or 6 years. And then I moved on to the research and policy department. And there was my first project, which is that we have to wait for, got to make our own heaven. But it was the first project where you have people who have the lived experience doing the research, right? Not an academic coming in the community and doing the research, who has no perspective of the community, no understanding of gun violence, none of that background, and making decisions and making policies or recommendations off their findings, right? This here allows us to really put us at the forefront to really talk about the true issues, as with Dr. Pryor, the root causes of what's going on, right? And I feel like what I'm starting to learn and see in this work is a lot of people who don't have that experience but have the accolades to be able to come in and talk about it and really put statements on and say this is true facts of what's happening in our community, which is not. So I'm really grateful to be in the position that I am as a research coordinator, because now I have control of this data now. I have control of this narrative now to be able to talk about what's going on. And really what put me at the forefront is my experience around gun violence, is my experience in gang life, right? As for me and my community, I'm also a big homie in my neighborhood, which is part of the street network, what we call the Bloods, right? And there as a leadership, I combine my research, right, in my neighborhood and letting them guys also have a perspective and also, let's say, so inside the work that we're doing, right? And they're also understanding what the narrative is going on about them, right? And bringing them in and bridging those type of gaps. So for us, my organization, as you know, Cure Violence and how that works, but here in research and policy, it gives me like a no rules type thing to really move about in the community and do my own thing and organize and bring true solutions and true, I would say true understandings of what's happening, right? Because everybody makes their own perspective of what's going on, but I don't believe if you're not there in the trenches and you're not there having those conscious, ethical conversations with these guys who we calling big homies, or we calling the shooters or whatnot. I don't think you can get that type of information to even make a conscious solution about what's going on. So, I think a lot about that too, Dr. Pryor, about if we're trying to understand what's going on. This thing goes all the way back to slavery, right? And the therapy part is so important because I talk about this all the time about it hasn't even been therapy since slavery to even understand that, right? And what's going on. There's guys out on the street still don't have that conscious understanding of like what does that mean about them? What does the world say about them in that context? It's not spoken about, so it's hard for them to understand and find identity in place of where they at, let alone the community, but let alone the world as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And to round us out, Miss Peggy Herrera, who's a member leader of Freedom Agenda, and also unfortunately now represents families who have been affected. And so we continue to send prayers. And the question is, what does your organization do to help connect with communities and leaders, particularly when it comes to responding to shootings? Thank you. Excuse me.
Thank you. My name is Peggy Herrera. I am a leader and member of Freedom Agenda. But most importantly, I'm a mom and a grandmother and a woman, and I'm a counselor for youth. So that alone, just being affected and impacted. My son was murdered last year at his birthday party. It was a shooting, and he got the worst shot. So how my leaders are involved in this movement is, first of all, before I've ever met my leaders, as a mother, I was already trying to do what I could do, right? Because you really don't know. And my leaders have given me a platform. They came alongside me and showed me that I wasn't alone in this fight. As a mother, while my son struggled with mental health, now that he was murdered due to gun violence, they've definitely come alongside me. And they're trying to make a difference. Because if you look at it, it's mental health and gun violence go together. Whether we try to separate it, we can't. We can't separate it. We know that those kids that killed my son didn't just decide to wake up today and say, I'm gonna go and kill somebody. That took time. That means somewhere along the line in their lives, there had to be trauma. There had to be some kind of abuse. There had to be something that led them to this place today. So as a mother, you know, I can't tell you that I'm angry at them, that I want the same thing for them, because I know too much. I have a son who suffered from mental health issues, and so incarcerating them and keeping them away, I know is not gonna prevent gun violence. And we can't continue to incarcerate our way into public safety. So we gotta address the issues of mental health. And it starts because we're looking at people and we're forgetting that they were once children. They were once little. And so if we go into the schools, if we go into our communities and educate and build relationships and tell people what we know, that's how we get involved. And my leaders have helped me do that. So together, they help me, and they give me a platform to go into places to educate. And that's what I continue to do along with them.
Thank you so much for that. And then before you came, we spoke a little bit. Just also wanted to make sure we're reiterating that, and I believe when Peggy and when I'm saying mental health, we're talking about the general well-being of all of us. That everybody should. I've been in therapy for 8 years. I always try to make sure I say that, particularly in spaces, Black, brown, immigrant communities where it's not talked about. I think all of us need to check in once in a while. You go to a doctor, you go to a dentist, you get a check in with a professional just to talk a little bit. But what happens when your personal mental health is affected in traumatic ways, which is different than people who have acute mental health crisis? Because we want to make sure we're not criminalizing people who are in acute mental health crisis, because they're no more likely to be violent than anyone else, and they themselves are likely to be folks who are violent against them. So I just wanted to be clear about that. But thank you for pointing that out. I know folks got the questions. I might mix match a little bit, if that's all right. You know, I always talk about gun violence in two parts: the supply and demand. The supply is the guns that are coming in, and our Congress, of course, has to do so much more of that. You started out by trying to figure out where that source is coming in, and the other side is the demand, where I think a lot of us do work. Is that even if these guns are here, people don't have to communicate with them anymore. They don't have to pick them up. So I just wanted to give just a quick ways that your organization is working, either one of those, and also what's missing. Because I think if you speak to most folks, I said this before, I feel like we're in a time and space, and I haven't been in the past 13 years, where people finally beginning to understand that public safety is a holistic approach, but it's missing putting all those pieces together. So, you know, which part is your organization focused on, and what is missing from getting that thing that everybody knows is going to help prevent this gun violence from moving? And how do we do more of getting that missing part more connected? If it's connection, is it funding? Is it like I'm just here for folks. We just talk. You got a mic.
Yes, thank you, Jumani. That's an excellent question. I think that you're absolutely right. This is a very complex issue. Okay, so there's no one size fits all. We're all doing amazing work. There are none of us that's doing it all. We're doing our part. I think we could do better at coordinating with each other. I think sharing information and data and best practices would be key to the work that we should be doing. A lot of times we operate in silos, you know, and that gives you a little despair because you start to believe that, you know, you're doing this all alone. You're not alone. You're not alone. There are a lot of us out here. Many of us been out here a long time. A lot of people don't know I'm retired. I retired in 2019. I came out of retirement after the George Floyd murder because I had relationships both on the law enforcement side and on the street side. I could actually put the big homies in law enforcement in the same room, which I don't know if you know, is not an easy thing to do. And to have conversations that are very uncomfortable. And one of the things that we specialize at CCD doing is that we actually want to talk directly to those individuals who are closest to what we call the problem. So I don't look at an individual who might be a street pharmacist and say, oh, he's a drug dealer, you know, lock him up, throw away the key. No, I'm looking at his ingenuity. I'm looking at his entrepreneurial spirit. I'm looking at how I can introduce him to ways that he can transfer those skills into legitimate enterprise and at the same time put that gun down. I'm interested in letting them know that you don't got to use a gun to resolve issues. You don't got to resort to violence because you disagree with someone. That's totally unnecessary. And that's jails is for chumps. Nobody goes to, you know, and we have to change the narrative. So another thing we do is change the discussion, and we got to keep it real, right? I'm going to look you right in the eyes, and I want to talk about your little niece, your little daughter who you love, and my niece and my daughter who I love. And imagine your little niece coming home from school with her little book bag and somebody indiscriminately pulls out a gun and starts shooting and your niece catch one of them. See, that's a real conversation. And when you have those conversations with people, it makes them have to think twice about what it is that they're doing. But also, you also got to give people a way out. It's one thing for you to identify the problem. It's another thing for you to offer them a solution and an alternative and a way out. And so we also have to have the resources to say, hey, I can actually put you on a construction site and start you out making $35 an hour. All I need you to do is spend 5 days going through this OSHA class, getting this 30. I want you to get your safety license, and I will put you on the site. And we can do that, and we have done it. At CCD, we do it all. That means that we identify the problem, respond to your issues, connect you to services, try to help you address some issues if you want to address those issues, but we do it in accordance to what you want. We don't impose anything on you. We don't come in any community saying we know what's best for you. No, we ask you, what is it that you want? You tell us what you want, and that's how we respond. That's how all the programs at CCD are shaped. That's how they're designed based on direct response and requests that come out of the community. So that's just 3 or 4 things that we can do, because I like to be solution oriented. I don't want to spend all the time griping, and I think we know what the issue is. So I like talking about solutions. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah. First of all, I just wanted to say that I appreciate the public advocate talking about being in therapy. I've been in therapy for 18 years. I plan to be a lifer. And I always say to my own children that healthy people are in therapy for life. And that if you're not in therapy, you're much more likely to be unhealthy, to not get the support that you need. So I'm all for being very open about the support, the social services that we all deserve and need, and that requires resources and time. So I can talk a little bit about the supply and the demand, because we do both, and I'll try to be brief. On the supply side, a lot of people talk about gun laws and they talk about how they don't work, right? Because it does seem like they're not working. We have so much gun violence every single day. We hear about all this gun violence is happening all across the country. We have strong gun laws in some places, weak gun laws in others. We still have gun violence here in New York City. How can that be? And the way that I explain that gun laws work is pretty straightforward. Whether you work in policy or law, or you work, with communities, that in New York City and in cities across the state that do have high rates of gun violence, most of those guns do not originate here. It's not as though someone is going into a brick and mortar gun dealer shop, right? And buying a gun and getting a background check and then going and selling, 100 guns in a truck in Brownsville. The reason that traffickers go down to Florida, go down to North Carolina, go down to South Carolina, go to Virginia, or even go over to Ohio is because it's so easy to get them there legally. You don't have to go through a background check. And Florida now, in fact, the governor just signed a law that allows you to, without a background check and without a permit, carry in public. You can be just carrying a gun around in public without a permit in the state of Florida. And so if you can legally go to other states and easily buy a gun, then of course you're going to be able to traffic them into neighborhoods where we know that there's that powerlessness, where we know that there's that despair, where we know that there's that historical and structural racism that everyone's talking about here. People are going to feel afraid in those neighborhoods. People are going to feel like they need to protect themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so just statistically, we know that over 80% of the crime guns the guns that are used in crimes, whether it's a shooting or actually kills someone here in the city of New York and in cities across the state, are coming from out of state. And that's how I know that gun laws here in New York are working, because otherwise we just get them here, right? And then on top of that, okay, we're talking about that being mixed with all of these other strict structural risk factors that we know from all the public health research, and we know from the actual anecdotal conversations and research that we're seeing out in the community, are mixed with that easy access to guns, those guns on the market, right? If you live in an area where there's high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment, high rates of historical redlining, historical structural racism, right? Lack of access to education, lack of access to healthcare. All those neighborhoods are specifically much more likely to be targeted by the gun trafficking trade, and those neighborhoods are much more likely to have folks who are going to feel like they need to pick up a gun. Now, this is something that's not often talked about, and I like to say it out loud. Most people in this country still think that guns protect you. So, and we have a Supreme Court, right, that says that guns protect you. We have a policing system that says that guns protect you. We have a military that says guns protect you. So why do we think that we can go into a neighborhood with young, powerless Black men and tell them that guns don't protect them just because they didn't go through a background check, right? That's a very difficult tale to tell. Guns don't protect you. They actually don't, right? We know that when a mass shooter is going into a school, their security carrying guns, they're not going to actually be able to protect from that intrusion, right? We know that a gun in the home is far more likely to lead to suicide, an accident, domestic violence, a murder, than it is to actually prevent an intrusion. But the reality is people are afraid. And if we did a poll, I know, of students in New York City a couple of years ago on why there was an increase in trying to get weapons into the school, whether it was guns or knives or whatever it might be. And the reality is most of those kids were carrying those weapons because they were afraid. They were afraid of someone hurting them, whether it was someone they knew or someone they didn't know. It was not because they wanted to hurt someone else. And so when you have easy access to guns and easy access to weapons, but especially easy access to guns, which are far more likely to actually result in death, that is going to increase levels of violence. And you need those factors together, much more likely than not, for there to actually be a result in a violent behavior. As the public advocate said, mental health alone, a diagnosis of mental illness, is much more likely to be associated with a victim of gun violence, like we saw on the train, right? Like just a month ago. And that happens all the time. It's someone who doesn't have control over themselves, who is in a crisis. Not only are they more likely to be a victim, but they're also less likely to actually be able to protect themselves even if they had a weapon. So I want to pass the mic again, but we work on both of those sides, and I think it's important to talk about both, because if the guns weren't there, we know there wouldn't be gun violence. There would be some violence, but there would not be gun violence, and so we need to do both.
Thank you. I think it's important to point out, you said something very critical, which we said a lot, but the kids are carrying weapons because they're afraid, not because they're angry. They're not mean folks trying to intentionally hurt folks. And we skip over that first part, and we try to send things that deal with the second part. And if you don't have the right diagnosis, you're always going to have the wrong solution. So it's important to point that out. And I also tell folks, it's not about illegal guns, because every illegal gun was legal at some point. And so we have to figure out the legal point of purchase. We have a demonic obsession with guns, but it's another panel. But I don't know if anyone wants to address that.
I think, again, like how we talk about this, like Dr. Pryor was saying, this thing is so complex, right? Gun culture alone in America, right? And then the end gun culture is complex there, right? Yeah, what white people think is gun culture and what we as black people think is gun culture, but then on the street, what gun culture is like, right? I think I like to speak more from that point of view of the street, of trying to understand that, right? My research speak a lot about this, about not feeling safe and the deep distrust of law enforcement, right? The people who like supposed to protect us. It's a quote here that says from our research project, it's not the regular person I gotta worry about. I gotta protect myself from the people who are made to protect and serve us. So then you have that, and then also I'm sorry, your name?
Rebecca.
Rebecca was saying with all these other nuances of just lack of resources and all these things that play. But I think that the people that I'm talking about that's in the street or whatnot, they get more blamed on the narrative than actually people going out trying to find out what's actually happening, right? And as I do this work, I've discovered that more that the people who are actually involved in the work has more of a lack of perspective of what's actually happening because the distance of where they're doing the work is from the office. And I think like for me, I think we was most effective because we was out on the street, right? And we understand that. And for even my boss, Elise White and Rachel Swanner, these are two white women who didn't have the understanding of like what we call the culture and how this gun violence played on young black men and the complexities of the music, how that plays on it, the complexity of this thing that we call gangster, right? And all these other narratives that play in these kids' minds. And I think people don't understand that when we look in the homes, that's where it starts at, right? But then our homes are messed up, right? Our fathers are gone, the mother is working and whatnot. And if you're really paying attention to how our music is kind of changing that narrative of black men and black women, how they are bringing a relationship together, right? Which all plays on how the child is growing up and being developed. And if that's not there, what I've noticed is like America will raise that child. The media will raise that child. The cinemas will raise that child. The music will raise the child all the way down to their very block, right? So it's like they coming up with this own understanding of who they are in the world, right? And how they have to get by in the world. Knowing who they are in the world at the same time, like consciously but not consciously, right? Knowing the history of who they are or whatnot and how slavery, civil rights, Reconstruction, and all these have played a part to why they even end part of a gang, right? And again, joining those networks or whatnot because the lack of safety, right? For me, it's just like people need to really understand that. And I'm so glad that I have fortunate to be on this research project and also a second one that's coming out to really dive deeper into this on why these young men are carrying guns or why they are part of these street networks and do these things, right? I think that's just for me, the understanding part before we can even talk about a solution And those solutions are complex and various.
So just thank you for that, and I think it's important. And I think you were, I always say talking about the history of the country. It's always important because I think you have to tell people where the trap is so they can fall into it. And sometimes these young people, they don't understand why their community is the way it is. And I think there's a way not to fall into the trap, but it's always harder if you don't know where the trap is. So it's always good to explain the history. And I also agree the lack of sometimes of fathers and single parent households is harmful. But I just want to make sure I shout out to the Black fathers that are out there necessary.
That's right.
I'm one of them.
That's right.
My dad wasn't around the way he should be, but we didn't pass that generational curse down. So I just want to make sure I shout out those of us
right.
who are out there doing the best to try to do what they do. So thank you for all that. I do want to add to the question, Peggy, and we can keep. The thing I also think sometimes gets confused for me, and people. I want to hear from people who have that pain, and it's always good to lead with people who have dealt with this. But the issue of accountability versus actually stopping it from happening again. I think we have those conversations together, and they're not always supposed to be together, because we want to have accountability for something happening to someone that is real and makes the people who are harmed feel whole, but also have the conversation like, what else can we do that's going to prevent somebody else from mimicking that behavior? So in my original question, if you can just add some of that into the answer as well.
So, just thinking about public safety, that's one of the conversations that I have often in my communities. And in my situation, it's hard for some of my own people to understand where I'm at. But those who murdered my son, I am a strong advocate, and I am a mother. And yes, I will always advocate for them. And I don't think that we're going to incarcerate our way into public safety. But there are some situations that have to have consequences. And I do understand that there will be consequences, especially in a place where there's murder. I want to walk down the street and feel safe, like all of us. I don't want it to be where, I just forgive them in this. I understand that there is a consequence, but there has to be a consequence with services, no matter what. There has to be. And I also understand that there are some situations that don't need to be where they end up incarcerated. And we have to understand that too. I'm looking, as a youth counselor, I work with kids every day, and I'm looking at them and I see them recycled in the system. They leave us, we get a few that really make it, but then I see some that keep going back. Some of them are on Rikers Island again, and I'm like, we're not doing enough for them, But it's just because you're throwing them in a place that's just as violent, right? Because I'm sure that the mayor and everyone would agree for me not to retaliate, right? That would be something he wouldn't want. He wouldn't want the hood to retaliate against those who did this to my son. But Rikers Island is another form of violence. And the prisons are another form of violence. So if we're just throwing them in there without a plan, then we're failing. We're continuing the cycle. So we got to get to this place where we say, how do we help these people to process why they're in the place they're at today, why they made that mistake, why they did what they did, right? And if we don't do that, we're going to keep failing. And so now my focus is, we need to educate our little ones. We need to start going into the schools and preparing our little ones, because no one's thinking like the children, they're too young, we're just loving them, we're taking them, we're letting them see all these cartoons, we're taking them to Disney, but we're not really educating them, because we need to prepare them about mental health. We need to educate them on gun violence. We need to prepare them on grief, so that when they're sitting next to that person who's had a lot of trauma, they'll understand. They won't make fun of that person. And then as they grow together, they'll be able to help that person, as opposed to saying, I don't like that person, or, get them out the class. We need to start, instead of reacting, we need to start responding. And I think that's the biggest thing that's going to lead us to public safety. We all want public safety, but we don't want people to end up in a place that's more violent, where they're gonna come out, because they will come out, right? Some people are gonna go away and gonna come out, but guess where they're coming to? They're coming back to our communities because they're our people and our children. So we have to do better, and we have to start thinking of a way to help those as they're growing up, not just meet them where they're at now. And those that are grown already, that have had a lot of trauma, we need to meet them in a way where they feel like they're accepted, that they feel loved, that where they're not just criminalized all the time for every mistake that they do. So that's what public safety means to me.
Thank you. And then I want to hear from Jackie Rowe as well. But just really quick, how many people are anybody under 35? 35. Because under 35, and who is over 40? So the folks who are over 40, do you know anybody who was shot when you were young? And the folks who are under 35, do you know anybody who was shot when you were young? Okay. So the reason I ask that is because usually both sets of folks say yes. And to this question of accountability, it's strange because what we're doing to me should have worked back then so that these questions would not be answered the same over and over again. So I always say, trying to lock up the young people, the children of the young people we locked up 10 years ago or 20 years ago is probably not going to have the impact. But as mentioned, sometimes folks need a timeout, and sometimes there's some consequences. So I always want to make sure I'm clear on what does accountability look like, and is it changing? Is it going to change the person's behavior? More importantly, is it going to change somebody else's behavior if you haven't changed anything else? And I think that's important just to bring to the conversation. But I would love to hear your opinion on this one. Sometimes we go a little different ways on it, but it's important that everybody hears all the things that are important that we need to discuss.
Thank you so much again, Jamani Public Advocate. Thank you for bringing this. To Mom, you are brave. You was not here when I introduced myself, Jackie Rowe Adams. I lost 2 kids to gun violence. So we talked about what are we going to do. We heard from different people on the panel, which was really good. Everybody was so good, and that's what we need. But I want to talk about the social and emotional piece. This is what our organization deal with, Harlem Mothers Say, but our public advocate hit on it earlier. Because we started off as Harlem Mothers Say, but because we had so many men, fathers, who always tell people fathers cry too. And so now we are called Harlem Mothers and Fathers Say, which is key. We have a lot of fathers in our group. As I say, we started with 5 mothers. Now we have 50 plus mothers and fathers and grandparents. We deal with the social and emotional because we can't bring back our kids. We deal with the trauma. We deal with the mental illness and mental health because we have a lot of families, especially mothers and fathers. We have some fathers want to commit suicide. This is all connected. And so we have a counselor that deal with the social and emotional and the trauma and the grief. We meet every first Monday of the month. And it's not easy. But how do we come up with a solution? We've been talking about the issue and the problems and how, but let's bring in the churches. Nobody's talking about the churches. Look how the Church of the Covenant is open. Open your churches. Let's open these churches. These churches are vacant. We talk about resources and programs and how can we save our children and how can we deal with all this trauma that's going on, and how can we have a safe city, a safe community? Open your churches. They got space. Let's go out there and bring not only the kids in the church to the programs, but let's take it to the street. Churches need to go to the street and open up these doors. That's one of the solutions. That is a solution. I want to say to some of you that might have an attitude that don't like the police, but let me tell y'all something. As soon as something happens, call 911. So we're going to have to start working with our police department a little better. No, are they perfect? Absolutely not. But you know what Harlem mothers and fathers do? Every year, twice a year, we hold cops and kids. We create, because you got to start them for 5 years old. I heard the mom say, we got to start them at 5 years old, because these kids are smart. It starts at home, it starts, whoever your guardian or leader is. We have to take back our kids and take back our community. And that's what we have to do. We have to continue to do it. We could talk about many things, but let's talk about what's so serious. We are losing our children, whether they black, brown, or green, or Chinese. We are losing our families, and we have to take it back. In order to take it back, we got to work with the police. We got to work with the mayor. We got to work with the elected officials. We got to work together. And we have a real problem with these guns coming in, but you heard that earlier. My thing, and when we talk about bail reform, that's what our organization been fighting, this bail reform. And I know that was the argument of arguments. But guess what? If you do the crime, you do the time. But we have to open these churches and have a place, and the pastors got to step up and say, this is the program I have in this church. Not only the churches, these community centers that's getting all this money out here, you could do a little better than you're doing. Because this organization's getting money, know how to talk, know how to write, and ain't doing half the stuff they need to. So these are the things we need to start doing. Let's get it together, and let's don't put the blame on only health. It is, let me keep, mental health is real.
Yeah.
Because I have some. So mental health is definitely real. I have some issues. But we can work with it if we work together, work with the police, work with your community boards, go out here in the street, and let's pull these problematic kids or these borderline kids. Let's try to save the kids that want to get in trouble, but not in trouble. So we have a lot of work to do.
So thank you.
That's what I want to say, because you know that the public advocate like to cut me off. But anyway, we have a lot of work to do, and so that's what we got to do, and that's what Harlem mothers and fathers is doing. Thank you.
No, I thank you. You brought us some pieces I'm hoping you bring up. There's a lot of pieces, and could you speak for a lot of folks? And it's important. I will say I always want to make it clear that, public safety, I believe law enforcement has a role to play. I believe part of the problem is we ask them to do all of the roles, and that becomes a huge problem. Yes. Because they can't solve all of these, or if they would have already. So I concur. People call 911. Sometimes they should not be calling 911. They should probably call 988 or 311, so we can get some different services. But if we really want to support our men and women who come in and want to help folks, we probably should stop asking them to solve all of these problems. That's right. And fund these agencies and fund these community groups so they can fill the gap. Absolutely. I'm probably gonna leave the bail form alone now because it's a whole nother thing. But I would say, and this is me, I'm not speaking for any other agency, I wish the governor had spent as much political capital into addressing mental health, housing, and some of the gun violence programs that she did on the bail reform, because she even said she did that because she was focused on headlines that were coming out, not the real facts behind the bail reform. So I'm gonna say that part. But it is important that everybody plays their part and has their role to play. It is important that we're not labeling one thing or the other. We're really just trying to figure out how to address the issues of public safety in a holistic way. And that's what I say, because I think everybody knows of these takedowns. I've seen one in Washington Heights. There's one in East Flatbush. And sometimes that may be necessary at a moment in time. But then my question is always, what are you doing after that? Because you're going to be back here in a couple of years, because we haven't done anything to fill the gap. And so I know you want to respond to accountability, but I want to add something else in there. Remember there was a shooting near a school, and they were saying they were sending more law enforcement to the school. And I said, well, what else are you sending? Because simply sending law enforcement is probably not going to solve the problem. And you should have a way to pull them back at some point. And everybody got a real answer to that. And so when you answer about the accountability, I'd also just like to know what else can we be doing proactively at the acute point when there's violence, but in between that, so that we can prevent the next acute thing from happening in the first place.
I'm gonna say that, like, being in America and understanding, like, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, like, guns aren't going anywhere, right? It don't matter, like, what, if you stop them from coming in New York, if that's even, I don't even think that's possible because of how many guns are here in America, right? And then the access, it's unbelievable how you can get them right then and there, right? So when it goes to accountability and responsibility in this complex conversation, for me on the street and understanding like what's happening right now, because we can talk about, it's funny how we talk about things, but people who's not on the street doesn't understand what you're talking about. It's some shit that happened probably like 6 years ago. It's not happening, what's happening right now, or even the conversation of what's happening, or even the lingo, or the style, anything like that, right? That people don't understand how it plays into the culture, especially when we're talking about gun violence. And then you got to understand the part that a lot of people don't like to talk about is gangs. Gangs are so huge to Black communities, right? Especially young Black men. So as far as me, as a big homie in my neighborhood, I automatically have accountability and responsibility to the ones that's a part of the street network, but also to the folks that's in the community, because the folks that we're talking about are the young boys who's a part of the street network, are their aunties, their grandmothers, their mothers, and stuff like that, and their fathers, right? So for me, it's like when we talk about these gangs and understanding that, right? Because that's where most of our young men goes to, right? And it was created by us as a safety thing, as we know. Today is different now, right? But it's also a part of what we are talking about when we're talking about shootings among young Black men, right? You cannot forget to bring this ideology of gangs in there, right? And starting to really understand that, because it's really who they are. It's part of their identity, right? So for me, as that, understanding that, and then understanding what comes with gangs, right? And the historical part around that, right? And protecting your neighborhood and giving your brother and sister like a steady shoulder to lean on, providing them a roof over their head, anything that you can provide for that brother, because he's outside or she's outside because of the home and their structure is not right, so they're in the streets, right? So with that, there's rules to these things. There's rules to gangs. There's oath to gangs. They have creeds, right? They have all these things that you must follow, right? Because it gives you a self identity. It gives you structure, right? And then most gangs that you know of are representations of Black Panthers, right? And a lot of their knowledge is of Black Panthers, right? But through our time and history and whatnot, and the challenges that we face, a lot of this knowledge is forgotten and it's not applied to, right? But for me, the historian I am, and the position I hold those rules because I truly believe in them. I hold that oath because I truly believe in it. And with that gives me accountability, right? It gives those guys accountability and responsibility to what they are part of and what they're standing at and what they do in their neighborhood, right? For me, it's correcting that narrative on both sides, on the media about gangs, but also to the guys who coming up in these gangs thinking what gang banging is, right? And that is complex when you start talking about West Coast gangs and East Coast gangs, right? And how that comes down. But for me, it's like if you're doing something destructive in your neighborhood, you're going against all the values that this thing is talking about. And I must hold you accountable to that, right? You must know the rules and anything that you are getting a part of this and standing on that, because you're actually a soldier for your neighborhood. You're actually a protector for your neighborhood, right? And bringing those things back alive and bringing those things and speaking those things outside on the street to these young men. Having these conversations with these young men, parents, also with the mothers, who also knows who, they know what their child involved in. Only thing that for me that's different in my neighborhood is like I'm very out front with my work, and I'm very on social media with my research work, and I'm very engaged with the parents there. So I have parents come up like, I know my son is a part of this, right? I'm just fortunate enough that he's with you. But these are the things that he's been doing. He hasn't been going to school. This is the thing. So I bring him in, and we sit down and talk with him. Why you ain't doing this? What's going on with this? You know you don't do this. You got to deal with this, right? And giving them type of structure and building those relationships. So the mother who had this perceived thought of what this gang thing was like sees it on a different light, right? And then us also bringing in the resources that we have at CJI and being very honest about our position in the streets and who we are and how we can bridge those gaps and bring those solutions together and that understanding as well.
Yeah, so thank you for having some historical narrative there, but it's always interesting because I think with this conversation, what usually leads is fear, and so it's always people want to be safe. You have a right to be safe and feel safe. I say sometimes you're actually really safe but don't feel safe, and you respond the same way. And I think a lot of particularly elected officials, because we got to get elected, fear helps you get elected. And so I've seen a lot of people trying to deal with this fear instead of actually trying to deal with the issue itself. And so I want to close out with just a quick couple of questions. I'm not sure if everybody can answer. Is it 3:30? We're finishing? Yeah, so I feel like some of the work has stagnated. I think when we got the funding for the Cure Violence, which is awesome, I think a lot of folks just started chasing that money, and if they didn't get it, then they got it. And there's a lot of different layers, I think, that we should be trying to do.
Yes.
The Adams administration did its own survey last year and asked New Yorkers, what should we do about public safety? The first two answers were mental health and housing. They didn't get to law enforcement until the third, but I feel like we did in the third, and we focused that on the most as opposed to the first two. So it's just me speaking, feeling like we've stagnated on that work. What are some innovative ways that we can jumpstart that again and get this innovation going? Because not everything's going to work. And how do we try and figure out if this is working or not? How do we integrate the things that are working in a way that's not? So,
You sure? Is it my turn? Okay. Thank you for that. First of all, I actually just wanted to extend an invitation. I would love for you to come talk to our young people in our school program. I'm just going to state the obvious. I'm like the white lady lawyer here on the panel. And so obviously I am not a credible messenger. One of the reasons that I do this work, though, is because I am so focused on the impact of our school program that I do not teach, but that I do go into the schools with our staff. And that's the thing that speaks to me the most, because it's those conversations that you're talking about that are happening with the young people and the openness that they are sharing with our instructors about what they're experiencing, about gang affiliation, and then giving them the knowledge and tools that you're describing from someone who has lived experience, but also knows the historical background. Like, that is so empowering for them. And I would just love, I would love this whole panel. And I know we talked about it with you, Public Advocate, about you coming to talk to our students too. Would love for you to be a part of that in any way. So let's talk. In terms of integrating, I always, I know that people find it overwhelming that we need to address housing, we need to address gun regulation, we need to address mental health. And so it feels very unwieldy. But I think that if you focus in on those topic areas and certain solutions that you have data that shows that they are working, and you keep pursuing it, sometimes it takes longer, right? Sometimes we want to see an immediate impact because we have an immediate problem. And that's the whole issue with bail, and I won't start arguing with you about that. I don't necessarily agree, and the data isn't there, right? And there also hasn't been that much time to show that bail reform has been working. So how do we find concrete solutions and pursue them in a way that is actually going to be strategic and integrated? And I think when it comes to mental health, it does mean bringing in those social services and investing in those social services where the most impacted survivors are living, right? And I think that, yes, we do work on strategies that are happening out in the community in terms of intervention in crisis after the fact, but our schools and our young people in our schools are very close to the issue as well. And they're only a step away sometimes from the violent behavior because of the school to prison pipeline, because of what they're being exposed to out in their neighborhoods. And so we need to be investing more in mental health and counseling in our schools. We are over-policing our schools. There's a huge emphasis on kind of turning our schools into feeling like prisons, whether it's metal detectors or having, either uniformed police or ununiformed police in our schools. To me, that doesn't feel safe. Why would that feel like a safe space to be? There should be more support in our schools, and there should be investment in counseling in our schools. And there should be better access in a targeted way to mental health services in our communities too. And we need to be talking about that in a very concrete, methodical way with data to show it and to watch how that actually has an impact over time through investment and not just kind of running around doing anything that seems to stick and that the public seems to react to because it's what they're, it's what's been driving the politicians. Number one, with housing, I think it's the same thing, right? Like we need to invest in our affordable housing in a way that's really impactful, and we need to do it over the course of many years so that we can actually see some improvement. Some of the specific solutions that we're working on in Albany right now, and I'm looking straight in the eyes of my colleague from Common Justice right now because we're working on a solution together. Here's an example of kind of the intersection of those things. So we're working on a bill right now that just passed in both chambers and needs to be signed by the governor. It's called Fair Access to Victims' Compensation. Right now, under state law, you can access state funding if you are a victim of a crime or of gun violence. But a prerequisite for being eligible for that funding is a report from the police. And we know from listening to this panel, right, and from all the public health research, that a lot of people legitimately are afraid to go to the police, especially after they've been victimized, especially Black men who are the largest group of victims of gun violence and violence in this state. And so we need alternatives. And we just passed this bill in in both chambers, need it signed by the governor, that will allow as an alternative an individual to go to a victim service provider like Safe Horizon or another qualifying contract victim service provider to write up that application, to give that narrative, to show that this happened, and to qualify for that money. Why is that money important? It's important for two reasons. One, it's compensation, right? It's justice, it's a remedy for lost wages, for mental health resources, right? For hospital bills, for funeral expenses, like very specific concrete issues that need to be addressed. But also because when those things do go unaddressed, when people are, impoverished because they can't even pay for funeral expenses and they have to go on GoFundMe to ask for help from the community, they're more likely to engage in crimes of poverty. They're more likely to engage in an act of retaliation because they're in crisis. And so it not only is a remedy, but it also stops the cycle of violence. And we need to be investing in those types of specific types of solutions in an integrated way so that we can see change over time. It's not going to be something we're going to be able to change overnight. And I think that any politician that promises that is not someone you can trust, right? They're not going to be able to show that over the course of 4 years, I promise you. And so you want someone who's going to stay the line, right? This is the way the public advocate has. Stay the line, be consistent, and continue to invest in the strategies that work, like cure violence and like mental health resources and prevention in schools.
Thank you. And can I just get permission to go for another 5-6 minutes, if that's okay? People who are here? Oh, okay. So I'm leaving. Is that what's happening?
You're unavailable.
Okay, so you're gonna have to come up and finish. All right, I thought let me just get this question and then we'll keep going, and I guess Salome will take over. I did want to just really quick ground it in the impact that mental health has in our community. A lot of communities, they have a shooting in the school or something. There's a great response into mental health in terms of what folks see and get assistance with. So many of our communities don't. I remember when I first doing this, the work to get the funding for the first cure violence stuff. There was a young man saying he saw somebody get killed and threw the body off the roof. What does he do with that one that's talk about it, what to do with it? What happens when they're dealing with all this trauma and someone comes and steps on your foot? Like, there's a lot of stuff that is not acute mental health crisis, but is mental health. And so my question is, how do we address that a little bit more? I wanted to get to, and then you can get to this, like, more of the healing questions about how our community heals. So this, okay, so that's important. And before I leave, I did want to make sure I mentioned some stuff that Dr. Opara was alluding to. We actually know how to address the violence. And so what came out of that task force, I'll never forget, was Dr. Khalil Muhammad, who was there, who reminded us that violence, as is mentioned, not new. As a matter of fact, decades ago, it looked a little different. The complexion of the violence was different as people came from Europe and folks came, and Gangs of New York was a movie, if people remember that. Yeah. It showed gangs, they were shooting up police and all that, and the fighting with police, fighting with themselves. And the social elite at that time said, these folks need upward mobility, they need programs, they need jobs, they need and that was provided. But when the violence and complexion changed, the response was, these are people who are victims of their own self-destruction. And if anything was provided, it was law enforcement and incarcerated situations. So what we want to do is just do what we know works. And we have to have, and that doesn't mean we don't have accountability. I just want to thank everybody on the panel before I leave, particularly those who have been a part of the system, but especially the mothers. I hope God I never joined that club and don't know what that pain is. But the fact that you can take that pain, irrespective of where you take it, to try to stop it from happening to other people, I just want to say thank you so much for that. And that is so valuable that people who are in pain are coming to try to provide solutions to prevent other people from being in pain. So I just want to thank you for that. But I want to set that stage, and I think I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Zahed to respond, and then I'll sound them coming. So thank you, everybody. Peace and blessings. I want to appreciate you.
We got for y'all.
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, we don't really have the time to really get into this issue the way we want. But for those who might not have grasped what the public advocate just said, because he's just such a polite and cordial elected official. So he, at times, and he, just like me, he's not trying to hurt anyone's feelings, but we need to point out the obvious. And when he said, the gangs of New York, if you read the book, if you saw the movie, it was about Irish immigrants, white people who were really engaged in some violent behavior. In fact, laid the foundation for today's NYPD. Then when the complexion changed, when it was people of color and black folks, it was a different response. The same with the opioid epidemic, right? Black people, brown people, people of color have been dying from opioids for centuries, and the response has been dismal. When the complexion changed, now all of a sudden we have to be very sensitive about addressing it. We need to provide treatment and support and counseling and therapy. And it's just so obvious and so unfair. And when are we going to deal with that? See, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to pass it, I promise. My grandchildren, I won't even talk about my children, they don't always agree with my decisions. A lot of times they disagree. But you know one thing they agree with? Grandpa always fair. See, as long as you know that it's fair, you don't have to agree with the decision. But when you know that you've been treated unfairly and unequally, when you know that your opinion hasn't been taken into consideration, you've been disregarded, when you know that you're always on the periphery, it doesn't make a difference how good the decision is that's made. That feeling of treated unfairly is just so bitter. See, that's where we have to address that part of it. Again, it's a very, very complex issue. As I said, when I'm not at CCD and advising the organization, the executive director on policy issues, I'm doing the work in the People's Police Academy, bringing non-traditional folks to the table. Even in my own dining room, I've had folks who clearly would never, under any other circumstances, sit in a room with each other. They're on opposing sides. But yet that's hard work that has to be done. You know why? And let me tell you this, and then I promise I'll pass it. Law enforcement is not going away. Okay? As much as you want them to, you can disagree, but they are not, you're not going to wake up one day and they're going to be gone. So since we know that they're a part of the community, you need to be managing the affairs in your community. And if in fact we handle our business the way we're supposed to, we'll decrease the need for them to have to come into our community anyway. And when they do come, we can manage those relations. How do I know this? Because it's done in communities right here in New York City. We need to step it up, and that's where accountability comes in. Every member of society has a role to play, man, woman, and child. And nothing pains me more than a mother who's afraid to go into her son or daughter's room and search the room. Because if the community decides no more, if we have a zero tolerance and we say, you can't run, you can't hide, we ain't provide no safe haven for you, you're not going to wreak havoc, you're not going to rob, you're not going to steal, you're not going to hurt people, and think you can walk around in our community, no bueno. That's all that needs to happen. But it has to be the whole community, because once that happens, then you see a cease in violence and in crime. But there's some work to get to that point. So just figured I'd throw that out there, give you something to chew on, and I'm going to pass it. Where am I passing? Please pass it that way. There you go, my sister.
I have a few things to say. I'm going to be as brief as possible. I cannot expect my 10-year-old child to go to work and make provision for my home because he's only 10. There are some things we cannot expect from people that don't have it, okay? Mental health is very real. As a mother who had a child that was impacted by mental health and was criminalized, was arrested for calling for help for my son, I understand that there is a system in place that doesn't support us. And I agree, we do. We have to continue the fight to limit them coming in and providing what's really needed in our communities. Mm-hmm. What is mental health services? We're all talking about mental health. I hear the mayor saying, you know, we need God back in our schools, we need nutrition, we need all of these things. Who does that apply to? Because he's trying to keep Rikers Island open and not provide services while every day people are dying in there because of mental health. So let's really talk about it. Let's talk about, okay, so you say you want to do these things. So then let's do it. Does it apply to those on Rikers Island? It should. They're human beings too. And they will come out. When you see a behavior, you look, if you can understand a behavior, when you look at a person and you see a behavior and you understand where it comes from, you're able to help that person, right? If you know a person is stealing and robbing, why is that person stealing and robbing? Most often, it's a drug addiction. So why don't we provide that service? It can't just be, for myself, I say 6 months of treatment. You have to go away. You have to go and you have to undo that. It takes time to unlearn a habit. So we have to really, really deal with the issues. It's really addressing the issues. If it's mental health, let's really address the mental health. Let's just stop looking at the behavior and dealing with the behavior, because we're not going to make somebody better. We have to deal with the trauma. Okay. We don't want to go into a place where we have regrets later on, like we had with the Clinton administration, where they had to apologize because the drug on wars did not work, as we can clearly see. That's why we are where we're at today. Why do kids join gangs? Because they don't feel safe. What if we made them feel safe? If I don't have a bed, give me a bed. If I'm hungry, feed me. I'm sick, make me better. It's clear, it's just common sense, but we don't want to look at it that way because we want to look at just the behavior. He's stealing, he's robbing, he's misbehaving. That comes from somewhere, okay? My 11-year-old was homeschooled. He was homeschooled, okay? He wanted to go to school. My husband died of cancer. He was my last one. So he wanted to go to school. When I sent him to school, someone gave him a book bag. 11 years old, while I worked for NYPD, while I was working for them, they escorted my son in handcuffs at 11 years old. How did that help him? A child who had a lot of trauma in his life. He saw his daddy die in our bed. How did that help him? He was 11 years old, which led to them continually targeting him in my community. Mm-hmm. So we have to look at what's being done. I'm not saying that, you know, every issue we have to overlook it, but we have to really see what's going on. And it begins in our schools. I'm really starting to see that we need to start going to our schools and start educating our little ones and preparing them. because a lot of them are dealing with trauma and abuse at home, and we're not addressing it because we're dealing with the youth. We're dealing with the older ones. Now we're taking away from education, and we're taking that money and giving it to law enforcement and building more jails. I don't understand how that's gonna help our communities. It's not gonna help our mental health. Mental health services is not just a pill and counseling once a week, okay? It's more than that. If I'm hungry, you need to feed me. I can't tell my kid to go to school today, and he's like, I'm hungry, and I'm like, go to school, have a good day, be good. No, there is more. We are hungry. Our communities are hungry, and they are starving, and it's time that we address the harms. We gotta address them and undo them, and yeah, it looks impossible right now, it does. Right now, sometimes I'm like, oh my goodness, but you know what? It's gonna take time, because the amount of time it took for them to put all these policies in place, the amount of years that they've done this to us, the system is not broken. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. Okay, so let's start to address and undo, okay, the harms, so that we can make our people better and our communities better. And I'll end with coping skills. How do you not, you're incarcerating someone, or you're not giving them any coping skills. The only coping skills those kids knew that killed my son and shot up that party was, if I do this is the only way I know how to do it, is get rid of you. I'd rather get rid of you. I don't know how to deal with you, so I'm gonna get rid of you. The only way that certain communities deal with certain communities, I don't like you, I'm not gonna deal with you. I don't like Black people, I'm not gonna deal with you. I'd rather just throw you away, put you in a hospital for years, mandate you to a hospital. We have to start looking at the policies. We have to really make it make sense now. And as a mother, I look at that. I'm not just looking at these young men as somebody who, as a murderer. I'm not. I'm really not. I know too much to stand there and say those boys deserve to be thrown away. I do. They're human beings. Yes, they messed up bad. They took my son, my baby. But you know what? If we continue to do the same thing and expect a different outcome, it's not gonna happen. We gotta do better. I'm sorry, we need to do better. And I wanna thank you for the for that bill that was passed. I was up there in Albany fighting for that. I unfortunately am one of those that is on the end of that compensation. So I thank God for them even working, for all of us that we work so hard to let that bill, to fight for that bill to get passed, because it does help. It helps with our healing. I'm part of NAC, Not Another Child, with Miss Reese, that lost her son to gun violence 17 years ago. Unfortunately, I didn't sign up to be a part of any of those groups, but I am. And for the one, because there was 3 others that got shot, but for the one that I lost, for the one, I'm taking the hundreds. I'm gonna fight for the hundreds. And not because they're doing the right thing, or because they know how, but it's because we have to fight for the system to change, to do better for where the system has failed them. And that's where I stand on that. Oh, and one more thing, bail reform does work. It works. It's just that we're not addressing the real issues. Okay, we're not providing the programs, but it does work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Peggy.
You got 10 minutes.
And thank you for everybody on this panel who has come here. We're gonna wrap up pretty soon. And again, the reason why we had this conversation is because oftentimes we tend to focus on mass shootings, the sensationalism around the Second Amendment and whether or not guns belong in our community. But as you've heard panelists share here very clearly, we live in a society that's structured in a way that's not going to be dismantled instantaneously. We're going to have to live with what law enforcement and corrupt law enforcement looks like. We're going to deal with states that don't have gun laws that actually protect people. We're going to deal with this obsession that our country has with guns that other countries don't have. But what I really wanted to speak about is how we break the intergenerational trauma that has taken place because of guns and the grief that has been unloaded on our communities as a result, and that shows up in so many other ways. And so for everyone on this panel, in 3 words, what does healing look like for you? What does healing look like for you? In 3 words. if that's
Well,
possible.
you know, it's more than 3 words, but just let me say healing, I deal with every day. As a mother who lost 2 kids to gun violence, healing is hard. But you don't get over it. You move forward. You'll never get over it, but you learn how to deal with healing, especially when you have a support group. You need support. And when you have a support group and you're dealing with the different moms and families that have had a loss, like you heard the mom say, healing is not easy. But that support and working with the community and your family, you will deal with it. It hurts every day when you're trying to get out the bed. The mothers can't get out the bed. The fathers can't get out the bed because that pain and you healing in order to get up. So, but you will learn to deal with it through a great support team and let your mothers and fathers and family knows they are not alone. I'm not going to talk about bail reform because the killers and the murderers and the robbers, that's what the bail reform is for. The good part is working, but the bad part got to work too. Thank you.
I will try to keep it to 3. I would say counseling and uncomfortable conversations and community. Those 3 things for
You could
me
explain
are about
that.
healing. You want me to explain that?
If you want to,
Um,
you have the option.
I mean, counseling is sort of obvious. Like, I think we all deserve counseling individually and as a group. I think uncomfortable conversations for me, like this conversation is healing, right? Like being a part of the conversation, being in the space and holding space for others and listening is healing. And community, like community is always healing. And I would say, when I mean community, like I hear very much loud and clear that a gang is community, right? And so we all are looking for that community structure in some way, especially when we're going through those like developmental years of 12 to 18, like that's when you're trying to figure out who you are and where you belong. But it's a lifelong journey of being part of a community. And when you feel like you're a part of that, you feel like people support you, that can be healing. So that's what healing is for me.
3 words, bring back humanity. Right, human justice. If we could just come to one understanding that every human being has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, that you have the right to be safe and comfortable. Food, shelter, water, these are not things that you should have to fight for. You don't got to pass an eligibility requirement. As a human being, you deserve to be treated with compassion and caring. If we could just restore humanity, we'd be 50, 60, 70% ahead of where we are now. Every human being, I don't care what your race, your creed, your sex, any of that, if you are a human being, in fact, if you're not human, that everyone, every living thing, every living creature should be treated with tenderness and care. If we learn to love, if we just do that, we'd be leaps and bounds ahead of where we are now. Human justice.
Thank you.
I would say vulnerability, understanding, and patience. I think healing takes a lot of patience.
For me, I want to say that my son left behind a little boy. He didn't know his fiance was pregnant. And so my grandson, I will fight. I will fight every day for that. Also, love, and that's biblical. You can't get around that. The Bible clearly says, treat others how you want to be treated. It's not whether they deserve it. It's God didn't call us to say, love if they deserve it. He said, love one another. Love your neighbor as yourself.
That's right.
And that's where it starts. It doesn't matter how we look. It doesn't matter what race. It just matters that we love one another and that we use our voices, even in opposition, that we use our voices to speak for those who don't have a voice and love everyone.
Thank you. Give it up for all the panelists one time. Thank you to Dr. Becky Adams, to Dr. Fisher, Dr. Devon Pryor, Hassim Spate, and Peggy Herrera, who all come from different walks of life to share the ways in which we can deal with guns and grief. And I just want to acknowledge that although we may have different perspectives around how we get to a place where we can have harmony, I believe that every single person out here is trying to show that community and creating an intentional, loving, compassionate community is the foundation of us being able to bring true healing and transformation to the places that we live in this city, which is a complex city to live in with complex personalities and multiple economies, hidden and public. How do we put it all together? So this is hopefully the first of many more conversations that we will have that don't focus on the sensationalism about what violence brings through guns, but about the ways that community connects together to bring solutions. And that's why we're here today. That's why we brought everyone to this conversation. So thank you to everyone who's been tuning in live on social media, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to extend this. And again, thank you to the public advocate for being here, and thank you again to all of you who came here in person. So have a great day, y'all. Many blessings. Peace.
I remember CCD has like that special, one of your teammates, I know you're
Yeah.
has like one of those QR codes.